populace. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Eugenie Say.
No, you don't.
Oh, Catherine Delahunty. I do it. It's a second. Catherine Delahunty. Absolutely. I'm sorry, Catherine.
That's fine. We've had Eugenie. Now it's Catherine Delahunty's turn. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koe and tēnā koutou te whare ko tēnei pō. We are also happy to be supporting Jackie Dean's bill. We really believe that we need to deal with this issue by increasing penalties, which this bill does. And I understand the passion of a member like Jackie Dean for a private member's bill. It's very hard to get one selected from the ballot, and then when you do, it's very hard to get, when one does, it's very hard to get it through the Parliament, and so this is very satisfying for her. I also have a bill before the Local Government Select Committee, or it was, with less success, but I understand exactly the passion that people feel about bills that they have tried to shepherd through this process. So, this is an important bill because it sends a good message to the courts, and I think we've heard a lot of detail. We don't need to hear any more about it, actually. There's been a lot of repetition tonight about some of the clauses, and I think that's all very interesting. Clearly the Local Government Environment Select Committee has done a good job, and the bill will be useful within its frame of reference and will send an important message. And actually the whole issue of collecting illegally, as well as the strange brutality that people sometimes demonstrate towards wildlife, is a very old problem. The 18th century, and European collectors started coming over to Aotearoa and taking species, alive or dead, and taking them back to Europe for their own purposes, for financial gain, and often for museums. And so we've had collectors such as Andreas Rejcik, who in the 19th and early 20th century, who robbed graves, took taonga katoa, and took various species with him, in the hope of making a name in Europe. And in those days it was acceptable to a degree, and that's the sad thing, is that there's still a market for such a noxious trade, and as others have said, it's a big market, and it's still a major problem. And our wildlife, although we're at the end of the world, are extraordinarily unique, and we need to defend them, and not just because of the description in the initial conservation report on this bill. Conservation was defined in one of the officers' reports as a valued part of brand New Zealand. Now, that may be true, but it's a very limited way of looking at the world. One of the reasons we're defending the wildlife is not just because they're a brand, but because they have intrinsic value in our community, and they also have intrinsic value to kaitiaki katoa, whose whakapapa goes back more than 1,000 years and has relationships with many of these taonga. So I think it's really important that we get beyond the shallow and recognise how deep the relationship is in this country with some of these species, how unique, how important, and how vital it is that not only we don't let people smuggle them, but we also defend their right to exist. And the biggest threat to the species is not actually something this bill addresses, because the biggest threat to the species is pest control and loss of habitat. And that is why it's so important that we commit to a coherent, not just a random, but a coherent approach to conservation in this country, and that we recognise the Article 2 rights of tangata whenua in relation to taonga, such as previously mentioned by my Labour colleague, species such as Maui's dolphin. So if we look at these wildlife, I think there's a lot of contradictions in discussing this tonight, because much as the bill does good work and we support it, it's very interesting when we come to perhaps one of the most endangered species in this country, the Archie's frog, the pekahua, which is in my area where I live, not my electorate, but where I live. The Archie's frog is the rarest frog on the planet, and yet this government has given a permit and supported a permit for them to go into that area and the mining industry and mine inside Archie's habitat. So on the one hand we're doing the right thing, on the other hand we're actually allowing the greater threat. So if we're going to allow the greater threat, we need to be honest about that and say, yep, it's okay, we're going to stop smuggling, we're going to stop acts of random cruelty, but actually we're fine with destroying habitat. And I have a picture here tonight of a postcard that I've got of the great spotted kiwi, an iconic species which is going to be damaged if we allow the mining of the Denniston Plateau. And it's the green gecko, a species that is intrinsic to the Denniston Plateau, and other species such as the great spotted and the giant snail are all vulnerable, not only because of bad people and smugglers, but because we're actually committing other forms of vandalism towards the conservation state as well. And so it's important that we acknowledge those contradictions and those threats to biodiversity, and remember that we are all guardians and have a responsibility for protecting these species for future generations. And that's not a rhetorical statement, that's about consistency and acting properly in terms of the environment, because these species cannot flourish in isolation. They are not just iconic, charismatic species. They are our environment. We need to protect them. We commend the bill, but we'd like to see a consistent approach to conservation from this government before it's too late. Kia ora tātou katoa.
I call the honourable member